Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us for this week's Stories of Music and our continuing look at the history of Canadian rock music. This week, we're talking about the 70s. Now, you may recall from last week how I mentioned during the 60s, there was a couple of dominating events occurring in the UK and the States, and that really helped to define the decade as a whole. Specifically, I'm talking about the British invasion, also known as Beatlemania, and in the later years, the hippie movement with Woodstock and Monterey Pop and that sort of thing. The 70s were very much like that in Canada, in that there were 3 or 4 events that not only shaped the decade, but had a fundamental effect on Canadian rock music specifically as a whole. And it starts right at the beginning of the year with the founding of the CRTC, the Canadian Radio and Television Commission, and specifically in 1971, their installing of the CanCon rules. In a nutshell, this told radio stations that they had to play a certain percentage of Canadian music during their programming day. The effect that this had was that radio stations right across the country literally were looking for Canadian music. So there were bands that would have otherwise potentially stayed very local and small that in effect started to find national audiences. Some of these bands were actually from the previous decade. I'm specifically talking about Chilliwack from Vancouver, or Toronto's Lighthouse, or even the Stampeders out of Calgary. These could have stayed small, but found that larger audience as radio stations right across the country were looking to support and follow that CanCon rule. Staying on radio for a minute, you also had FM radio stations starting to program rock music specifically. Now, without getting into too many technical details, FM stations compared to the AM stations of years previously were able to program extended performances of songs. That means that literally listeners were exposed to more Canadian music more often, again thanks to the CanCon rules, and this highlighted Canadian music, Canadian rock music specifically, even further. Couple of bands to come out of this: Rush, a band that we've actually gotten a lot of stuff in the store recently, and also BTO, Bachmann and Overdrive, which Randy Bachmann's band coming out of course, Guess Who. Also in the mid-70s, you had the beginning of the Juno Awards. Now, you might remember us mentioning the RPM magazine charts in videos past. These morphed into the Juno Awards, and they were actually named for Mr. Pierre Junot, although in that case spelled like the city in Alaska. And he was the first president of what? Of the CRTC. So now you've got a little bit of circular event happening. So they started as the RPM Awards in the mid-1960s. By 1970, 1971, they started to become known as the Junos. And in 1975, for the first time, they were put on television. Effect of this, right across the country, using another media, we now have Canadian music at the forefront. Couple of years later, the same people that were responsible for the Junos, the Canadian Academy of Recording Arts and Sciences, produces the Canadian Music Hall of Fame. Again, this was in 1978. Given out as part of the Juno Awards to an artist every year to highlight their career. In 1978, it happened to be Guy Lombardo and Oscar Peterson. The following year, in 1979, Hank Snow. This is something actually that is still given out today. 2021's recipient somebody that I remember from when I was younger and who could very well pop up in our video of the 90s. That would be Calgary's Jan Arden. So the upshot of the entire decade is you had a number of events between the CRTC, development of FM radio, the Juno Awards, and so forth, that really, compared to the previous decade, brought Canadian music specifically to the forefront. Now, this is going to continue in our next decade, in the 80s, where you will see more Canadian music being highlighted even more, not just nationally, but also to international audiences. However, we're not going to talk about the 80s next week. We're going to save that for the following week. Next Thursday is actually a pretty special anniversary for us at Retro Sound. We're going to highlight that instead, and you're not going to want to miss that because there's going to be some interesting announcements happening there. Thanks for joining us this week, though, on our continuing look at Canadian rock history with the 70s. We'll see you next time. Bye for now.